So as the British came up to this cobble fence with American defenders, the Americans fired. The 50 or so cobble fence defenders instantly disappeared in a thick plume of white smoke. Likely only half fired first, the others fired next as the first reloaded. Their musket balls formed a wall of lead that flung towards the helpless British, ripping into them and decimating their front rows, their bodies tumbling onto the beach and into the river. The next rows of British staggered as they struggled to maneuver over the carnage that had been their brothers in arms. But the New Hampshire men kept an almost incessant fire on them, mowing them down 4 at a time, rank by rank. Officers and privates fell alike, their blood mingling with the small tidal pools that had collected on the beach.
I'm pleased to introduce this evening's speaker, Derrick W Beck. Mr. Beck is a historian whose writing has appeared in multiple history journals, scholarly works, and reviews. He is a major in the U.S. Air Force Reserves, a graduate of the Air Command and Staff College, and the recipient of numerous medals and awards for his achievements.
So, 2 books, both of them tell the entire story of the Boston campaign together, but they stand alone, so you can read one or the other and pick up where one left off. The first one is on the left, and that covers from the Tea Party to the end of the first shots at Lexington and Concord and the start of the siege of Boston. I'm going to cover a little bit of that. And then the second book kicks off with the start of the siege of Boston really is just begun, Battle of Bunker Hill, and then there's, I'm going to get into that in a little bit here, but that's the kind of the focus of this talk. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to the Battle of Bunker Hill. And the reason I'm talking focus on the Bunker Hill is because we just did celebrate the 241st anniversary on June 17th, which was this past Friday. So why history? Why study history? Why read history? I think the reason is it's exciting. And Mel Gibson kind of shows it there in his face, I think. The Patriot, some people question whether or not it's accurate. It's certainly not accurate, but it certainly generates interest in history. And when people get that interest, they go looking for books like this and try to find the facts and come to places like this, and it inspires interest. So I think that's good at the very least for the Patriot. But the point is, it is exciting. So that's kind of my take. So who am I? We kind of covered that, but one of the key takeaways is when I went to Los Angeles Air Force Base, I discovered my interest in filmmaking and made a few short films. And I actually started this book project, both books together, as a massive film script for a movie. And so I was actually I was in the Air Force, learned my interest in film, and then I came here to MIT, thought this would make a great film. I've never seen Paul Revere's ride in a real cinematic way other than little clips on documentaries and such. And so that's how I started it. I left active duty Air Force to become a reservist to focus on allowing myself time to write. But I remain pretty active, spending a good 6+ months a year on active duty still. So this project, again, going back to history, the academic answer is why study and read history is because it's our roots. It tells us where we've come from. Hopefully learn from the past and don't make the same mistakes, although we frequently do, unfortunately. But I think the best answer is exciting. How I achieve that is, there are a couple key things there, you can read them, but the focus on real people. So George Washington is portrayed in some books as a superhero. And yet, I like the fact that in his own letters and such, he expresses doubts. He becomes relatable. The British are underrepresented in many stories of the Revolution, yet they have real, logical decision-making behind everything they do as well. And when you understand both sides, you can really appreciate all the nuances, and sometimes the good guys are not the good guys, and sometimes the bad guys aren't the bad guys. And I like that, those shades of gray, and really understanding the Revolution, warts and all, just really appreciating all those nuances. Because I started as a film, it's chronological and visual. A lot of histories will tell a block of time, and then they'll go back in time and tell what's going on over here at a different site, and you don't necessarily see the cause and effect that happens. So I've had a lot of reviews about my books that say it reads like an action novel. And the other way that I achieve that is there's a lot of stuff in history books that bogs down the story. So when there's a gap in information, if you want to continue that narrative, you have to make some logical guesses based on circumstantial evidence, and then you have to defend yourself to the history community with footnotes and maybe appendices. I beefed up the endnotes and appendices, and you'll see that in the book, to basically move that stuff out of the narrative and put it in the back. That way the narrative reads like a story, as if you're there watching this unfold in front of you, and then I defend with plenty of footnotes and appendices where that information came from. As a result, the main body is smooth flowing and it doesn't have those issues that some history books have. And where I need to, I caveat with perhaps this happened here and that sort of thing. So the first book starts with the Boston Tea Party, which is pretty exciting to talk about because it kind of started right here in this room. And I'm going to recap basically essentially, one of the interesting things about the Boston Tea Party is that the tea had been taxed for some years in Boston at 3 pence per pound, and yet Bostonians were happily paying that and drinking their tea. But when there was a inventory, the East India Company had a large inventory and they were on financial hardship, they got permission to sell off all their inventory at a cheap discount to America. And in New York and Philadelphia, where most of their tea came from the Dutch through smuggling trade routes, the smugglers were very concerned that this cheap tea would now undercut their operations. So the resistance began in New York and Philadelphia, and they argued about this tax that the Bostonians were already paying, and finally Bostonians caught on. But later John Adams admitted that if New York and Philadelphia didn't start this resistance, Boston would have happily landed the tea and paid the tax on the imports because it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be on sale, and so they were already drinking it and paying the tax anyway. Why not get cheaper tea? Who doesn't like a sale? So the immediate results of the Tea Party, though, are the coercive acts. Parliament wants restitution for this tea, and they're going to force Boston to pay it. And so the coercive acts, as they're called in London, later the intolerable acts, as they're known here. There's several of them, 4 or 5, depending on how you do the math. But the most important is the Boston Port Act. It closed the port of Boston, put all these people out of work. And by the way, Boston is a peninsula with a very little neck that connects to the mainland during this time. And in the 1800s, they lowered several hills around here and sort of did landfill to create places like the Back Bay, and now you can't really see the old shape of Boston. So it's a very narrow peninsula, and it's very reliant on the harbor. So closing down the harbor puts a lot of people out of work, and it basically creates an economic depression. Meanwhile, they also passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which restricts freedom of assembly, like meeting in here to talk about this tea, having different sorts of meetings, local elections for locally elected members of the equivalent of their Congress back then. And all these things were restricted, and most importantly, the civilian American-born royal governor was replaced with General Thomas Gage, who is he's already the commander-in-chief of all forces in North America, but now he's also the royal governor for Massachusetts. And he comes here from New York to basically enforce these new acts, and with him arrived several thousand troops. And by the end of 1774, so the Tea Party was December 1773, within the next year, 3,500 British troops come into Boston. Prior to the Boston Tea Party, there were no British troops stationed in Boston. There had been some in 1770. After the Boston Massacre, they were ejected to Castle Island or dispersed to other locations in North America. And there remained a small regiment in Castle Island, which is, thanks to landfill, now connected back to Boston. But there were no troops up until 1774 stationed inside Boston until the Tea Party and the reaction by Parliament. 1 out of 5 souls at the end of 1774 in Boston were British soldiers. So what happens when you have a lot of people out of work, angry, and a lot of time on their hands, and by the way, rum is cheap and free-flowing, and now you have British soldiers that are stuck in a small peninsula, nowhere to go, things are going to happen in the streets. Brawls did happen. Escalation kind of built up through the end of 1774 and early 1775, both in Boston and out of Boston. And the ultimate escalation came in April when General Gage learned that the Americans had war stores in Concord. And his goal was to preemptively strike by taking those war stores and seizing them before the Americans could use them to attack the troops in Boston. So the revolution at this stage in early 1775 is really led by Dr. Joseph Warren. And a lot of people don't know who he is, but he is one of the key founders of the revolution in Boston. Everybody knows names like John Adams, Sam Adams, John Hancock. But by April 1775, John Adams is south in Quincy, I believe, somewhere in south, maybe Braintree. But the Samuel Adams and John Hancock are hiding out in Lexington because they're afraid they're going to be arrested for being part of the revolutionary leadership. Joseph Warren remains in Boston, and he's effectively the guy running things. Later on, after the first shots, Hancock and the two Adamses go to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, and Joseph Warren's the guy that's running everything in the Boston area. And technically, there's a militia commander that's essentially in charge, but he's elected as the president of this new, technically illegal provincial Congress. He's effectively sort of the acting governor against Thomas Gage. Now, of course, the royal government doesn't recognize him as a leadership position. So there's a myth that surrounds Joseph Warren, and so it's sort of unfortunate that I have to bring her up to dispel this myth. But this is Mrs. Gage, and she's American-born from New Jersey, and she was here in Boston in April. And there's this claim that she was the secret informant to Joseph Warren, that there was going to be this expedition of British troops out to Concord to seize these war stores. And really, there's no evidence to support that. Joseph Warren is a very smart guy. He's well respected in the community. He's in a small peninsula. Everybody that's out of work has become his eyes and ears. And he gets reports throughout the day of April 18th, 1775, that the British officers are decked out in uniform items as if they're getting ready for a patrol or a campaign of some sort. The key parts of the British soldiers, the light infantry and the grenadiers, these are the creme de la creme of the British troops. They're taken off their normal routine to rest up for some new exercise. Even British soldiers in their diaries are saying, yeah, right, we're going on some sort of march somewhere. And in the meanwhile, the Royal Navy stops fixing some of their leaky warships to start working on their rowboats. And it's just a strange thing. They do this a couple days in advance, and suddenly they're floating off of the HMS Somerset on the Charles River just north of Boston Common, as if, waiting for troops and preparing to cross them. So Joseph Warren didn't need a special informant to know what was obvious. In fact, later on when the British troops are preparing on Boston Common to cross the Charles and march out to Concord, there's several Americans that are in Boston that comment to one British officer that they already know exactly where the British are going, even though it's supposed to be a secret expedition. Pretty much everyone knows. So there's no evidence to support the Mrs. Gage myth, and more importantly, there was no need for that. And then furthermore, there's evidence that Joseph Warren later went to Boston Common and actually observed the British troops mustering and getting ready to hop in the boats. So before Joseph Warren seized the troops, he sends out the man on the left, William Dawes, as a precaution to alert Hancock and Samuel Adams of Lexington that the British might be marching out that night. After he confirms it, he sends the man on the right, which I imagine a lot of people recognize as the famous actor Jack Black. You be the judge. They look pretty similar, but it's actually Paul Revere. Clearly he recognized, or somebody's told him before that he looks like Paul Revere, so he's posed that way for us. Paul Revere rides out. He crosses by boat to Charlestown, gets a horse, and then ultimately reaches Lexington and Concord, and they meet up, Dawes and Revere, and then they're sent out by Hancock and Adams beyond Lexington towards Concord to alert that the Americans are coming. And that's what he says, right? The Americans are coming. Can you imagine if somebody comes up to your door in the middle of the night and bangs on your door, and maybe you don't even recognize this guy, and this guy's yelling, "The Americans are coming." If you grab your musket, you might be aiming it at the person at your doorstep, right? So the point I'm getting at is, it's commonly said that he said the British are coming. I'm trying to relate it to our way of thinking now. Everyone in colonial America at that time were British Americans, and not only that, they were happily British. They were happy not to be French, and they were, more importantly, they wanted to be recognized more like British. The big complaint they had was that they were second-class citizens. They wanted to be more like Britons in Britain, and so they were very happily British. Yes, they had issues with their parliament. It's not unlike the approval rating of the US Congress today, but they loved their king, and they assumed that the king was duped by the ministry and parliament and politicians. And so they were happily British, and they wanted to be more British. So if somebody came up to their door in the middle of the night and said, "The British are coming," they would have looked very confused at that person, because they were happily British and they thought of themselves as British. So Paul Revere did not say the British are coming. What did he say? Unfortunately, we don't know. He left a couple different versions of his march out or his ride out that night, but he doesn't say exactly what he said. But he probably said something like, "The regulars are coming," referring to the regular troops versus the militia, or the redcoats are coming, or the redcoats are turning out, which I think is how it's portrayed in the Lexington reenactments in April. But he definitely did not say the British are coming. Paul Revere, after Lexington, and I guess spoiler alert, he does get captured on his way to Concord, but another rider does make it to Concord, and then the message spreads. The militias start rising up. Most of them are on their way to Concord. Meanwhile, the British make it to Lexington to find the Lexington Minutemen in their way. Now, they're really not in their way. They're on this green, and the road kind of passes south, and the British should have just ignored them. But the lead companies of the British meet and confront the Lexington Minutemen Company. And who shot first is unknown, but there was a shot, and that's effectively where the revolution began. So who shot first is actually a pretty big controversy in Lexington and in other circles. Who shot first? I want to compare it to Star Wars. So who shot first? This is a controversy among a lot of 20, 30-somethings anyway. In the 1977 Star Wars, Han Solo shoots first against this bounty hunter on the right. And in the 1990s re-release, George Lucas changed it so that the bounty hunter shoots, and then Han Solo responds with a shot. And why I'm making this comparison is because it matters who shot first. And George Lucas, in this case, wanted Han Solo to be the victim. Well, the Americans also wanted to be the victim, and they were thinking ahead regarding the propaganda war that would come. And so it was very vitally important that they were not seen as the side that shot first. But what do we know? It's circumstantial evidence. We can't prove anything, unfortunately. And there's the green. This is the road that should have been followed to the south by the British, and most of the British stayed on the road. But we do know that east of Lexington, there was a shot attempted by some American on the oncoming British, and it misfired. So that's interesting, but there was at least one American that attempted to shoot first. At Lexington, there are different reports. The British side, they report that there was a shot near Buckman Tavern on the north side of the green. Meanwhile, all of the British reports for the rest of the day are corroborated with the American side. So there's no disagreement, for example, at the later battle in Concord at the Old North Bridge, where the British admit fault by having one of their soldiers fire first, and then several responded with a volley. So they definitely shot first and admit it, the British did, in the later skirmishes. But in the situation in Lexington, they claim that the shot came from the sidelines, from the spectators. Meanwhile, their reports, the British reports, are all internal reports to the commander or to personal diaries, and they have no obvious motive to, unlike the Americans with propaganda. The Americans, propaganda is their agenda, and they actually write all these statements within days and rush them ahead of the British reports by a fast ship to London to get published in the British newspapers. Meanwhile, some of the reports, the Americans' reports, actually imply that they never shot at all until the British shot. and then they responded. And some of the reports claim that they never shot at all, and yet we know the British suffered at least one injury, minor, and a horse, a British horse, was also grazed. Did they lie? No, they didn't lie, because the Lexington Company says that they did not shoot, and even the British don't claim that the Lexington Company on the Green shot. But in 1825, 50th anniversary of the battle, one of the participants on the American side only then admits, when propaganda is no longer an issue, that yeah, sure, there was a shot by Buckman Tavern, I saw it. And then the guy ran around the other side and he shot again. So only in 1825, 50 years later, when propaganda is no longer an issue, does any American admit that there was indeed shots by Buckman Tavern, which correspond with what the British think was the first shot. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. By the way, the Americans were hanging out at Buckman Tavern, likely drinking, while they're waiting for the British to come. So it's possible drinking played a role. The bottom line is we'll never know. It remains a controversy, but we'll never know. After Lexington, the British march on, and they go to Concord. There's a skirmish at the Old North Bridge, and then finally, as the militia have encircled Concord, they basically fight the British all the way back. The British Expeditionary Force is nearly destroyed because they're running out of ammo, they're exhausted, they're suffering heavy casualties. They make it back to Lexington on the way back to Boston to meet a reinforcement, and that reinforcement effectively saves them. And then they ultimately fight through the Battle of Menotomy, which is modern Arlington. And this is why, by the way, I call it the Battle of the 19th of April. A lot of references call it the Battle of Lexington and Concord, but the fiercest fighting was in Menotomy, which calling it anything else sort of ignores that. And then finally the British divert and go to Charlestown, and they cross by boat back to Boston that night. And then the militia that had been coming around encircle the Boston, and the British besieged in Boston. So one of the things I learned in elementary school was that the British are stupid by marching in column and in line formation. And by the way, I also learned that the Americans beat the British, the greatest army in the world. And I didn't understand how the British could be both stupid and the greatest army in the world. And it turns out maybe they're the greatest at the time, but they were definitely not stupid. It's just they were underrepresented, and a lot of books don't properly tell the British side. So marching in column, this is a shot from the Battle of Mogadishu as represented in the movie Black Hawk Down. But marching in column formation is sometimes the smartest way through an area because it's the fastest way through uneven terrain or obstacles. And so when the British are coming back from Concord to Boston and they're in column formation, they don't merely have their guys in column. They also have flankers, light infantry guys, going into the woods and surrounding the column and rooting out the American snipers. And they did a lot of damage, and that's sometimes underrepresented as well, but they did what made sense, trying to get the column safe and basically enveloping the column, most of which were the battered original expeditionary force, enveloping them in fresh forces and going through the houses side by side, burning some of the houses, which the American propaganda used against the British. But the reality is, if snipers were in these houses, it became a lawful target for the British. And the British effectively were doing the right thing for what they could, given the situation. And later on in the battles, when they line up in line formation, I'll talk about that. So after the Battle of April 19th, the result is the British are penned up in Boston. Meanwhile, there's more officers and more troops that arrive in Boston, and a couple of new officers and generals, including General William Howe, who's going to lead a plan to bust the British out of this new siege. So this is the situation. The blue represents the Americans surrounding the British in Boston. You can see Boston portrayed as a peninsula there, and they're sort of represented by a big red circle there. There's also in the bottom right Castle Island with their small regiment, and then the Royal Navy is the pentagon shapes scattered throughout the harbor. Dorchester Neck to the south, which is now part of South Boston because of landfill, but it's a peninsula at this time, is essentially a pasture land, and there's no real houses there, and there's no one living there. The plan for the British is to, by boat, cross the Dorchester Neck and then break through the weaker lines on the south side for the Americans, and then swing up through Cambridge, where the Cambridge headquarters for the Americans is, and hopefully break up the siege of Boston that way. That's the plan. The other no man's land is Charlestown. Charlestown is a tighter peninsula than it is today, and the town there is abandoned after April 19th. So there's really no one living in the town. It's a ghost town, and it became a sort of unofficial demilitarized zone between the American and British forces. And of course, that's why the Charlestown inhabitants left, because they were stuck between two major forces. So the Battle of Bunker Hill is June 16th, the Americans have intelligence that the British plan to do this sweeping maneuver clockwise from Dorchester through Cambridge. So the Americans respond preemptively by, on the night of June 16th, taking the Breed's Hill, which is kind of a foothill to Bunker's Hill, and there's this argument about why it's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, if a lot of the fighting's at Breed's Hill, but it's sort of academic. The Americans determined Breed's Hill was high enough and close enough to Boston to threaten it, so they started building a little fort out of dirt there, and they built it on June 16th in the nighttime, and the British heard it in Boston, but they essentially ignored it because they thought, what could the Americans do over one night? They were surprised by dawn the next morning to see a pretty established fort and some cannon rolling into position on that fort. The Americans continued to expand their fort so the fort was on Breed's Hill. They expanded it with a dirt wall, and then they built some little fortifications, and then a rail fence using the pasture fences there that they stuffed with hay all the way to the Mystic River. They even begun something in the back on Bunker Hill proper. So they did this while the British were trying to figure out what they were going to do, and it took a couple hours to reestablish what their plan was, but the British ultimately decide that they're going to meet the Americans, and their expectation is that the Americans are going to disperse pretty easily in front of the British, because the British are now on their terms as a pitched battle. It's not like fighting through the streets. This is a pitched battle fight, and this is where the British excel. So meanwhile, the ship's kind of repositioned, and they're going to support the landing. So what happens? General Howe determines that one of the secret paths that the Americans has not figured out is this beach path along the Mystic River. It's about 8 to 10 feet below the main battlefield. So it's down a palisade, it's a rocky beach, it's narrow, and the Americans don't appear to have recognized that it's there. So the plan is, William Howe, the British general, he's going to send troops up the beach and around the backside of the Americans and surround them. Meanwhile, the rest of the troops on the battlefield are going to stall as they wait for the envelopment of the Americans. So the light infantry is the one sent up the beach, while the rest of the troops stall but move forward, and the Royal Navy bombards Charlestown because there are snipers, American snipers there. The result is Charlestown is burned all the way down. The light infantry then attacks at the beach. So the Americans, sort of last minute, a New Hampshire colonel, Stark is his name, he realizes last minute that there is this way along the beach. So he has approximately 36 people stationed down there, and they build with the rocks a little cobble fence about knee-high, and that's their defense. That's the only American defense. So a little excerpt from this second book. So as the British came up to this cobble fence with the American defenders, the Americans fired. The 50 or so cobble fence defenders instantly disappeared in a thick plume of white smoke. Likely only half fired first, the others fired next as the first reloaded. Their musket balls formed a wall of lead that flung towards the helpless British, ripping into them and decimating their front rows, their bodies tumbling onto the beach and into the river. The next rows of British staggered as they struggled to maneuver over the carnage that had been their brothers in arms. But the New Hampshire men kept an almost incessant fire on them, mowing them down 4 at a time, rank by rank. Officers and privates fell alike, their blood mingling with the small tidal pools that had collected on the beach. The officers shouted and tried to push their men on, but British discipline failed. Without orders, some lead British blindly fired their muskets towards the white smoke that had replaced the cobble fence defenders, a fatal mistake. By awkwardly slowing to fire their muskets instead of charging ahead, the redcoats lingered within the lethal range of American musketry, which only allowed the Yankees to slaughter still more of the British, causing British bodies to pile up as hurdles of carnage for those behind. All this caused the column to compress on itself, the front ranks driven to a halt while the men in the back continued forward. The British officers somehow managed to drive the following companies forward in a feeble charge, but both momentum and initiative were lost. The unforgiving American musketry continued to wipe out the lead British soldiers until the column at last gave way and began to fall back. So the British main attack retreats, and there you have, suffer heavy casualties. Unfortunately, we only have the casualty report for the end of the battle, so we don't know exactly which ones came from there or later on. Howe is now faced with a decision. He's really just stalling with these troops here, waiting for the beach attack to get around. It didn't work. So now what does he do? He decides that he's going to march forward in this line formation, and the weapon that the British have is the bayonets that the Americans do not have. They really have hardly any bayonets. Now, marching in line formation doesn't make sense with modern weapons. However, in that era, the musket that all these soldiers on both sides carried is very inaccurate, and it takes, 2 to 3 shots a minute, depending on how good you are. So if the accuracy is only about 50 yards at best, if you charge forward while the guy's reloading and you have a bayonet and they do not, you'll probably get very close and they'll probably break in front of you because they're not able to defend themselves at close range. So that's really, the musket is really a long-range scare tactic to get close to use your bayonet. And the British should have marched forward and charged when they got within range of musketry, but instead, the Americans start firing at range, and some of the shots, if you create a wall of lead in a line, will hit their target, but for the most part, they won't. And the British kind of slow down and start firing back when they shouldn't have. And the British officers didn't order this, but the soldiers responded by firing back. The result is that the front rows stop while the back guys are trying to move forward, and they start to bunch up, and they're kind of stuck in this lethal musketry range, and they have the weapon of choice, the bayonet, but they don't move forward. And ultimately, they're forced to retreat with heavy casualties as well. So that's the end of the first assault. General Howe decides to change everything. You'll notice, too, there's a reinforcement getting ready to cross over. On the British left, he puts all of his troops into column formation. Now, if you run forward, even if the front guys get mowed down, and yes, it's unfortunate if you're the front guy, I suppose, but you're not going to be able to shoot fast enough to get a couple men deep, and they're going to be on you. The British right is positioned as before, and General Howe's hope is that the Americans are going to fall for his ruse. So they move forward just outside of musketry range, and I'm going to read another brief excerpt here. So as the British drew near, the Americans held their fire, waiting until the redcoats were still closer, uncomfortably closer. Suddenly, all at once, the British left wing broke their stride and charged forward, rushing up towards the redoubt. On the British right, the front line, comprised of grenadiers and light infantry, charged forward and began a feint, firing at the rail fence from a safe distance. Simultaneously, the second line of British right wing suddenly maneuvered into a column and surged left. Led by Howe himself, they instantly charged leftwards towards the redoubt's breastwork, passing British field artillery. In an instant, almost the entire British assault had become a swarm of columns rushing towards the weakly defended redoubt and breastwork. This surprised the redoubt defenders, but Prescott, which is one of the Americans I didn't introduce, and his men held their fire. Over at the rail fence, it was obvious that the position was no longer the objective, so its defenders immediately began firing. So here's what's happening. The ruse is he comes up in line formation on the British right, and then he turns them into columns, and everybody converges on the front, the American side of the American right. The light infantry, meanwhile, sort of stands off just outside of range and shoots at the American rail fence to keep them in check so that they can't augment and support the real attack here on Breed's Hill at the redoubt. With that much overwhelming firepower, and now in column formation where they can basically swarm the Americans, and meanwhile the Americans are running out of ammunition at this location in particular, the Americans have no choice but to retreat. The reinforcement does come over. The British do pursue to a point, but then they stop at the end of Charlestown, and then the Americans rebuild fortifications outside of Charlestown, and that's essentially the end of the battle. Dr. Joseph Warren, unfortunately, suffers. He dies at the battle. And there were questions. So he's in the redoubt. He's where the most intense part of the fighting happens. And there have been questions for decades on how he died. There were stories that he died being shot in the back in retreat. There were stories that he gave a dying speech. And there were stories that he rallied some troops, some Americans, to fire one more volley into the oncoming British attack. And there were photographs made when his body was reinterred for the fourth time in the 1850s by his nephew, who was a founder of Mass General Hospital. And so these are very early forensic photographs. Unfortunately, they didn't think to put a ruler in place because photography was new. So Dr. Sam Foreman, who wrote the biography of Dr. Joseph Warren, him and I corresponded. He did some research in some forensics kind of science in averaging orbital sizes for white males, basically could figure out some scale and determine that the entry wound there is a 0.5-inch diameter. Now the musket that the British carried was 3/4 of an inch. So this is smaller than that. Meanwhile, there's a blast hole out the back. The muzzle range or the muzzle velocity of a gun in that era was not very good. 0.5 inches, because it's not the 3/4 of an inch of a British rifle or a British musket, means that this is most likely a pistol shot. And a pistol was carried by an officer or an officer's servant. An officer's servant was a soldier that was promoted to be basically the butler and the intern to the officer, or it could be a civilian that was on the field. We don't know much about the servants, but we know there are quite a few of them. A lot of these officers had noble ties, and so they had this privilege to have a servant reload their guns and stuff beside them in fights. So it was likely a pistol, and most importantly, with the power of a pistol in that era, to be able to blast through the skull, it was likely very close range, which means the story that he gave a dying speech, very unlikely, and more importantly, that he probably did, in fact, rally troops to fire into the oncoming British, and he likely saw his assailant before he died. The ultimate result of the Battle of Bunker Hill was really nothing for the British. So the British total force, not counting the reinforcement, the entire assault force was approximately 2,600 people, officers and enlisted. As far as the American side, it's hard to know because some people came and went, they fired a few shots, then they said, we're good, and left. So there was maybe 3,000 participants on the American side, but no more than 2,000 at a time. The British, of that 2,600, suffered 41% casualty between wounded and killed. The Americans were more like 22%, including wounded, killed, and a few captured by the British. So what did the British gain from this? They gained a peninsula that nobody really wanted to begin with. They're still surrounded, and they lost a lot of officers and soldiers. So they gained a little bit of elbow room, but not much. They were still stuck in between. So I consider the Battle of Bunker Hill a turning point for the beginning of the revolution in terms of leadership. Dr. Joseph Warren is the de facto leader of the revolution. He dies at the Battle of Bunker Hill. George Washington has been elected as the new Continental Army general, and he's going to form these militia into a Continental Army, but he doesn't arrive in time for the Battle of Bunker Hill. He's on his way. So there's this passing of batons unofficially between Joseph Warren and George Washington. Meanwhile, on the British side, General Gage, the royal governor and commander-in-chief of all forces in North America, he's fired. He doesn't know it yet, but he basically knows it. He gets a letter to report back to England, and he knows what's coming. And General Howe, the battlefield commander for the Bunker Hill, he ultimately takes over. And it's ultimately George Washington versus General Howe for most of the rest of the Revolution. Meanwhile, Washington realizes he has no big guns to really force the British to evacuate Boston, and he has a major British force in Canada. And they are in Montreal and Quebec, but they ultimately consolidate in Quebec City. So the Continental Congress authorizes a new campaign into Canada with a different department under two prongs. Benedict Arnold is no traitor yet. He's ultimately going to become a hero at the Battle of Quebec City. And Richard Montgomery goes up through Lake Champlain, through Montreal, and ultimately to Quebec, and they meet up together to fight this epic Battle of Quebec City. And the campaign into Canada I had never learned about when I was in elementary school, and it's actually vitally important to the success in Boston because it ultimately does succeed in keeping the British occupied long enough for Washington to force the British evacuation from Boston. The Battle of Quebec happens on New Year's Eve, 1775, in a blizzard. It's pretty epic stuff, but ultimately the Americans do lose the battle. They can't take the city. In fact, no force has ever breached the inner walls of Quebec City. When the French and the English fought over it in about a decade earlier in the French and Indian War, the English general had to goad the French into coming out of the city, and then the English defeated the French. But they could not breach the walls. So, meanwhile, the guns. There are guns in Fort Ticonderoga, and Fort Ticonderoga is barely protected by the British. Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen do take that in May of 1775, but nobody brings the guns to Boston to help in the siege until Colonel Henry Knox is elected in December, and he goes out towards Fort Ticonderoga, and he's working on this deal to get oxen to drag these guns by sleigh over the Berkshires, over frozen rivers to the Boston area. And the famous letter he writes to George Washington is that he expects this noble train of artillery with, I believe the number was 134 heads of oxen. That's the plan. That's the way the painting depicts it. I went to Dorchester Heights near here where there's a monument and there's a little plaque that shows something similar with the oxen pulling the guns, and yet Colonel Knox doesn't get any oxen. So it's remembered incorrectly, and it's because Knox wrote this letter to Washington, and then he's actually in negotiations with this local guy that has access to all these oxen, and the guy's basically trying to strong-arm the new Continental Army for more money. And Knox throws his hands up, storms out. He sort of documents this in his diary, and then he hires a bunch of horses instead. So it's horses, not oxen, that bring the guns to the Boston area. And ultimately, I mentioned what happens with Canada. Washington forces, ultimately, the British out of Boston. He takes these guns, he puts them on Dorchester Heights to the south, and it's essentially the Bunker Hill morning all over again. The British are thinking about attacking. All of General Howe's troops say this is a bad idea. We saw what happened in Bunker Hill. A hurricane or nor'easter, or depends on how it's described by the participants, some sort of major weather event occurred that day to actually beach some of the British transport ships onto Castle Island. So they were in their boats getting ready to cross to attack, and they were beached on Castle Island. Weather intervened. They postponed to that night. The Americans continue to fortify Dorchester, and finally the weather gets worse and the British give up. And this is on March 5th, 1776, which is the anniversary of the Boston Massacre. Washington picked that day because he knew that the Bostonians especially would fight more fiercely on that anniversary. It takes the British, they finally agree to terms to surrender the city or town and leave Boston, and they agree to this, but it takes until St. Patrick's Day, 1776, for them to actually get out of Boston, all the troops. But the British will regroup in Nova Scotia and then move their campaign to New York. New York, Manhattan is an island. The Royal Navy can surround Manhattan and support the British troops better there. Plus, there's a lot of loyalists there. And all this happened before independence. So that's kind of a play on the title of the second book is The War Before Independence, and 1775 to 1776. And the reason for that is when I was trying to get published, some of these publishers told me that they were really interested in things that happened before the war, but they're really interested in 1776 onward, and I had to try to explain to them that the war actually began. You can't just declare independence without a lot of things happening before that. But those same publishers declined, and I found source books, which I'm thankful for publishing these books. So, last thought I want to leave you. If you think America's divided today, I would argue that we've always been divided. And so it goes back, for example, there's the Civil War between Captain America and Iron Man. I picked Captain America's side. But there's the real Civil War. Coke versus Pepsi. This war is waging in many restaurants across the country, even today. Or in the Revolutionary time, depending on the colony, some guess, it's not like there's an official poll, that maybe it's a third for this revolution. And again, in 1775, they're not talking independence yet. They just want more equal terms with British citizens in Britain. There's loyalists that are definitely against this, obviously, this revolutionary tactic. And then there's a large number of pacifists, maybe a third each. Maybe the pacifists are just not vocal about which side they pick. In Massachusetts, loyalists were definitely smaller. In New York, loyalism was definitely bigger. But the question is, it's easy to think retrospectively, which side you would be on because you know how everything ended. But would you sacrifice all that you have financially, your house, your life, your livelihood, for a revolution at this time? And, during that time, if you could place yourself in that time too, it's hard to know how things really would go. You're giving a large sacrifice to support the revolution. And comparing it to modern times, there are attempts of different kinds of revolutions today. So it's just an interesting question to think about. Really understanding both the loyalists and the British. It's not as clear-cut as maybe I learned anyway in elementary school. So with that, I'd like to leave you with, if there's any questions, if you want to reach out to me afterwards, you can find me at derrickbeck.com or on Facebook or Twitter. And with that, are there any questions?
How and why did you get started with this whole writing about history?
So I skipped that part. So I got interested in filmmaking in Los Angeles, and I actually started this as a film script, and then I turned the film script, which became too long, into both of these books. Really, I wrote them together. The ultimate goal remains now a mini-series, and I do live in Los Angeles and have a few connections, but nothing strong yet. It's taken me 8 years to get to this point, but the ultimate goal now is mini-series. Maybe in another 8 years, I'll get to this mini-series. The idea is band of brothers set in the Revolution, and I'm also tempted, and I've been asked, is there going to be a third book, which would start with New York campaign? And I'm strongly leaning towards it. No one has ever written an entire series of books covering the Revolution, and it's a massive undertaking. I hope it won't take me another 8 years to get to the end. But the war ends, the battles end in 1781, so I have quite a ways to go. However, I've gotten lots of emails and requests for the Southern campaign because it's underrepresented, and yet there's a lot of stuff that happens down there.
So with the when you were talking about the Charlestown, the Battle of Bunker Hill, how come there were no Americans blocking the town? Or maybe you said that, but I missed it. It seemed like it was easy for them to bomb the town with their ships.
Yeah, so basically the Americans don't have a lot of artillery early on, and so there's no way to really attack the warships at this time. And the people that lived in Charlestown abandoned it because they were stuck between two armies, the British and the American siege lines. So it was just a bad place to live at that point. And they were afraid that the town would be burned down. And ultimately, for what it's worth, the first thing that was built after the British left the area, in that area, was the Warren Tavern, which still exists. And it's named for Dr. Joseph Warren, and it still exists as a tavern. But originally, a tavern was also an inn, so this was a place where you could go and drink and eat and stay for the night. And now the upstairs is offices and such, but you can still eat there and such where in the first building in Charlestown after they rebuilt. So.
Do you think the British knew who Warren was?
Yes, they definitely did. So there was a few references in the British newspapers about who this Joseph Warren was, and the British officers, actually Thomas Gage met with Dr. Joseph Warren a couple times, and so they recognized that each was leadership. And Thomas Gage, for all of his, he's the quote-unquote bad guy, but when you actually look at what he's doing, he's actually a decent general given his situation, and a decent royal governor. He's stuck trying to enforce these rules, and at the same time, he's very delicate with how he enforces them, and his own soldiers are complaining that he's not rigid enough, essentially. And so he's very pro-American in many ways, and he's married to an American wife. His wife is American, and he's ultimately kind of fired because he's not hard enough on the Americans. So, but yeah, they did meet a couple times.
I wanted to ask about communications in that time. Like, how quickly would Philadelphia have known after Concord and Lexington that fighting had started?
We know the exact number, but I can't recall off the top of my head, but it's on the order of days. It's not very long. So, and a little side note too, so I think it took multiple weeks, but a small little hunting camp in sort of central Kentucky learned about the first shots of Lexington and decided to name their camp Lexington, and that is now Lexington, Kentucky. So, but that one took several weeks because there weren't a lot of people riding out that way. So.
You hear so many stories about why it was the Americans were so unhappy. I know this is, you could probably talk about this for a long time, but were they really treated so unfairly? I mean, they were British citizens. I mean, all British citizens have to obey the rules. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, part of the complaint was, it's lots to that, but part of the complaint was, early on especially, the no taxation without representation. So they had no representative representing their interests in Parliament, so these parliamentary rules were being established, and they had no say. Is it fair, for example, this, depending on where you want to count the revolution as having begun, some would say it began with the treaty that ended the French and Indian War, and that's in 1763. And so the French and Indian War was fought between really the British with the Americans as a reserve force. And by the way, the Americans learned a lot of their, Indian-style guerrilla fighting from the British, so the British definitely knew how to fight this way. But the British and the Americans fighting against the French and Indians, which created this sort of safe zone on the western side of the colonies for the 13 British colonies. So it established a peace and a settlement. It also added Canada to the British colonies, and meanwhile, there was a lot of money spent on this war, and so Britain thought it was time that the Americans, which were never taxed, would pay a little bit on import duties. It's not like an income tax. It's time for the Americans to contribute a little bit because the British Parliament and the Treasury were empty because they were defending America. So now it's America's turn to spend a little money to rebuild the Treasury in London. And so it was fair that the Americans would pay some sort of tax, and a lot of Americans thought that was fair, but they thought that they should have the right to tax themselves and contribute in that way, and that's what they had always been doing for local taxes, but they had no say in how the taxes were being applied to them. So that was part of the issue. Part of the issue was, ironically, these like coercive acts in Boston were getting very rigid and strict, and yet Bostonians complained very loudly that Canada, newly added to the empire, being a Catholic colony because they were formerly French, Britain was actually very liberal and ahead of its time with how it dealt with the new French Catholic colony, and people, the Puritans and such in Massachusetts, complained to Parliament, how dare you allow Catholics in the empire? You fought so many wars with France to keep Catholicism out of the British Isles, and now you're allowing it into the British Empire. But So it was ironic that the British government was being liberal to the French, the new citizens of the empire, while being very strict and overbearing to the people of Boston. There were many better ways to deal with the issues in Boston, but putting people out of work and forcing them to pay back this tea was not going to end well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but. So even though Americans thought that he was this great king that had no idea because all of his ministers were duping him, in fact, he was very well aware of everything, and he wasn't making the decisions. Lord North, who was the prime minister, was really behind a lot of it, but the king and Lord North talked frequently, and the king was well aware of what Lord North was doing, and at times encouraged it, so he was very aware.
Your last slide said, which side would you be on?
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion? Do you share your opinion? And is it written in the spirit of you being completely objective and just doing the research? Or were you swayed when you did the research around this?
So the first question is, I would probably, given my situation now, I'm part of the U.S. Air Force, and so I'd probably be a loyalist. And but it's definitely interesting, and obviously, things that are happening today are unlike things that happened then, so it's not exactly a perfect parallel. If I was then, I don't know. I'd probably. It's hard to say. It depends on. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and the Air Force has given me lots of opportunities, but maybe I'd be a dock worker back then or something, and out of work, and then disgruntled, and who knows. But to answer, what was your second question?
Just when you were, after your research, when you were writing the books, is it completely objective, or do you feel like it's written in the spirit of one way or the other?
Yeah, so I think it's very objective. I think I've had a lot of reviews complimenting that it seems unbiased and shows both sides. And I avoid the word patriot. The word patriot means a lover of one's country. So the British loved their empire and their country too. And so choosing not to use that word, unless it of course appears in a quote, is deliberate to not tell the audience one way or the other which way to think. I'm just trying to tell the story from both sides and allowing the audience to decide what they think. So I think it's pretty balanced.
When the British were going to Concord, were they told to take the stores of at any cost? Were they planning to do battle that day?
They were not, because they actually had hardly any shots in their little cartouche box. So I forget the exact number, but it's something on the order of like 21 shots, which isn't very many, and certainly not enough to fight through an enraged countryside. So they didn't expect anything. They thought their expedition was a surprise. They'd show up, they'd seize these war stores, or in most cases, they weren't going to seize them. They were going to destroy them, dump gunpowder into the river, and put spikes into the touch holes of the cannons so they couldn't be used, or like break up the cannon carriages and stuff. So, but they didn't find most of the war stores because the Americans were alerted early enough, and they dispersed them to different farms and in the woods and such. And so it was a wasted march in the end for the British, but they began the war. Had the war not started that day, though, due to the escalation, it would have begun soon. And there was actually, as it's discussed in the first book, but there were actually several flashpoints where it was just barely averted before that day. So it was coming. It was just a matter of time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
We protest against the whole system by which the legal existence of the wife is suspended during marriage, so that in most states she neither has a legal part in the choice of her residence, nor can she make a will, nor sue or be sued in her own name, nor inherit property.